Hello, good morning, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Harry the Cosmo, freelance football journalist for BBC Sport and others, and I'm here again to look back at Newcastle's 1-0 victory over Brentford on Saturday night at St James's Park. It was one of those games where the result meant more than the performance. It was a game where Newcastle just had to win off the back of 3 successive defeats in the Premier League. It was a game where Newcastle just needed to get back on track, just needed to find their feet again against a tough opposition who did exactly what they promised they would. They sat deep and they made it difficult. They were really compact, and it was a lot more tough. The game didn't open up like it did last season, where they didn't really have a defensive midfielder to sort of counter the sort of threat through Bruno Guimaraes. That didn't really happen last night. I thought Newcastle had to be patient. They penetrated well, particularly in the second half, and Anthony Gordon was excellent again, but there was a lot of more patience. There wasn't the game didn't really open up at all, to be honest, and Newcastle just took their moment when it came through the penalty. Getting to whether I thought it was a penalty in a minute, but I think generally, yeah, it wasn't one of those games. I said after the game on Twitter that it was a game, the type of win that builds foundations. It was the type of win that you need when you're going into a Champions League campaign, which starts on Tuesday in Milan. Very exciting, and again we'll get onto that later. It feels like this is the type of victory that you just need to get done, that get the points on the board, and they sort of create the foundation for the season, because the performance won't matter so much when the games are coming thick and fast, particularly at the high level that they are. With the Champions League group that Newcastle have. But the fixtures are kinder on paper. There's a lot more games like this where Newcastle just have to be there and grind out the result, particularly when they're favourites, and that's not been the case for the first 3 games. I think Newcastle haven't really gone into a game this season as huge favourites in any one, and then they've only really turned up and performed properly in one game this season, I would argue. I think there was a lot of issues yesterday. Again, Dan Burn was targeted on the left. I thought he did okay, but he was targeted on the left, and the press wasn't there. I saw an interesting point that somebody made before the game about the extended period of time that the games will carry on now, because Newcastle had the least amount of ball in the pitch last season, and that was obviously a clear tactic from Eddie Howe to rest and recover from the press and the intensity that his team played with in short, sharp bursts. And Newcastle can't afford to do that anymore, because the game is going on for much longer because of the added extra time. There was 9 minutes of stoppage time in the second half. The game went past 100 minutes. Newcastle aren't as intense in when out possession. They're obviously missing Joe Willock and obviously Joe Linton, who is going to be out for a few weeks with a recurrence of his knee injury that he suffered on Brazil duty. So that personnel and issues, but Newcastle just aren't pressing as well. They're not as effective in what made them so good last season. I think that's quite a worrying trait generally. I think if Newcastle are to get back to their best, and obviously the Champions League is going to have an impact on this, especially the way Newcastle play. They didn't overwhelm Brentford in the first 20 minutes as they tend to do and try to do at home. They didn't manage to get them to succumb to that high energy, but they ground out the result. Personally, Anthony Gordon was the man of the match. I thought he again was fantastic down that right hand side, obviously in place of Miguel Almiron, cutting inside, which was really interesting. I think he was the chief threat again. Callum Wilson, just by the style of play he has, I think maybe Isak would have had a similar issue. He obviously started up front. Isak probably rested for the San Siro on Tuesday. I think Alexander Isak might have dealt with the situation of being isolated a bit better, just because of the style of forward he is. He's much more all round. He can drop short. He can link play much better. I think Callum Wilson's game is just naturally as a player who comes alive in the box and scores and plays between the lines of the 18-yard box. And I think that's something that made him more isolated, and Newcastle struggled to get him into the game, and particularly in the first half. They struggled to get any sort of rhythm, and Brentford, well, without creating too many clear-cut chances, they cut through as I sort of predicted that they would in the preview. I thought that they would get through Newcastle on the counter-attack quite easily with Mbeumo, Johan Visser, obviously not Kevin Schade, who's on the bench, but they just didn't have that clinical edge that they would need to get the win. And I don't think you could say that Brentford were unlucky. I think that they had some chances and were in the game, but they didn't threaten Newcastle too much. Sven Botman was back, and his presence makes such a huge difference. Sean Longstaff was able to unlock Bruno, as I questioned in my preview video. That felt like much more natural progression in that midfield, and I wonder if we'll see more of that going forward, particularly as the games come thick and fast, maybe more in the Premier League. Sandro Tonali was on the bench, had a bit of a knock from international duty, but should be okay for his return to Milan on Tuesday. I didn't think it was a penalty though, I must admit. I thought Newcastle were a bit lucky with that because, as Alan Shearer said on Match of the Day, the goalkeeper was pulling out, and Thomas Frank is right that the penalty that they didn't get on the first game of the season against Tottenham was exactly the same, and it didn't feel like it should have been a penalty. I'm quite surprised that was given in a way, but also it levels out that a perfectly good goal by Callum Wilson earlier in the half was chalked off for a very strange reason. It didn't feel like the contact on the goalkeeper was enough to cancel that goal out, and either way, whichever way the decision went, there wasn't enough probably on VAR's part to overturn. So yeah, I think it sort of levelled out in the end. I think Newcastle didn't deserve the penalty, but scored a perfectly good goal. So 1-0 is the natural and fair result. But going forward, I think it is quite worrying that Newcastle aren't playing with the same identity, and over and over again, Dan Burns' lack of pace down that left is getting exposed and pointed out at, and obviously with Rafael Leao actually playing on that right hand side for them on Tuesday, that's going to be very, very interesting. We'll get into that in a video tomorrow. I'll be back to preview the Milan game and how everything around that game. This was just a game that needed to be won. Newcastle, didn't really matter how they did it to get back on, to get the confidence going, to go into that game in Milan and just in full of confidence, full of excitement to appreciate what this experience means. But I think generally speaking, if Newcastle are to get back to their best, they need that intensity in midfield back, whether that's Sean Longstaff with Bruno, and you got to remember that Joe Linton's missing. Joe Willock is going to be out for a few more weeks as well. Tonali wasn't quite fit, so there's a lot of issues personnel wise in midfield that are contributing to that lack of press, but that is fundamentally why Newcastle aren't firing. They don't look like the same team at the moment, and generally that is quite a worry. But the victory is all that matters, and Newcastle go to Bramall Lane next week in the Premier League against Sheffield United with a real opportunity to get back in the top half. The really good thing I think about the team selection that Eddie Howe made, which obviously dropping Isak to the bench, not resting Tonali, bringing Elliot Anderson in, Sean Longstaff in. A lot of key players in that team will be fresh for Milan on Tuesday, and that'll show that they can deal with that situation. I wonder if Lewis Hall will be played more, given that the situation with Byrne and that lack of mobility at left back is being badly exposed by pretty much every team. I think that I've seen Newcastle face this season have all targeted Dan Byrne. I think going forward that is quite a bit of a worry. So Newcastle are up to 11th. It's quite reassuring in a sense that Newcastle took a while to get into their groove last season as well. But yeah, it was a good victory. I think Newcastle will go into that Sheffield United game after Milan in good spirits. I'll be at Bramall Lane on Sunday looking at the game. I'm not at the San Siro on Tuesday, unfortunately, but I've booked my accommodation and flights to Dortmund, and I'll be in Paris as well. So really looking forward to what is a very exciting period in Newcastle's recent history. I've got a piece coming out on the 20 years of the 20 years since the Champions League campaign in 2003, with a few faces from that team and that era, off the back of my book Black and White Night as well, on the BBC Sport website on Monday. So check out that. I'll be back on Monday for a preview of the Milan game. If you're going out there, enjoy it, have fun, and take it all in. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you then. Cheers.